Now, besides objects, we also have arrays in JavaScript, very important type of data. Arrays are created like this in JavaScript, as you know, and you can store any data in there. Numbers, strings, booleans, objects, other arrays. You can have nested arrays after all. And you can also mix data. You can have an array with strings and numbers mixed. And TypeScript also supports arrays. Any JavaScript array is supported, and the types of that array can be flexible or strict. Now let's have a look at that in TypeScript. For that here in app.ts, let's say our person also has a hobbies key. But of course, we could also have a variable or a constant hobbies outside of the object. So using arrays is exactly the same inside of objects and outside of them. So here we have hobbies, and hobbies could be sports and cooking, let's say. So I have two elements in there, and these elements, as you can tell, are strings. Now, if we hover over hobbies, TypeScript correctly detected that this is of type string array. Now, that's a syntax you haven't seen before, but this is how TypeScript describes an array of data. You have the square brackets, and in front of that, the type of data which is stored in there. Now, this is the type TypeScript inferred. It saw that here we have an array and that we only have strings in there, so it inferred that hobbies probably should be an array of strings. And indeed, for hobbies, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, you can also explicitly set the type of a variable. If we would add a new variable, favorite activities, and initially that should be empty, then we might want to explicitly set the type of data stored in there. And now let's say that should be an array of strings. Well, then we can just repeat what we just saw. Type string, and then square brackets thereafter. And this tells TypeScript what we store in here is not just a single string, it's an array of strings. And indeed, if I try to store just sports in there, I get an error. I get an error because that here is a single string and not an array of strings. I don't get an error, of course, if I wrap this into square brackets and therefore effectively I create an array. I again do get an error though if I add a number, let's say, because we defined this to be an array of strings. Now here we have a mixed array. It's an array of strings and numbers. So that does not work and is not supported here. If we would want to support such a mixed array, one solution would be to use any here. The any type is a special type in TypeScript, which we'll have a closer look later, which basically means do whatever you want. It's of course a type you don't want to use too often because you'll lose the benefits TypeScript gives you. You're back in JavaScript world, where you also can use any value anywhere. So any is really flexible, but the flexibility comes at the price of basically giving up all benefits TypeScript offers. So here I want to go back to string because I really don't want to have a number in there, and hence we can remove the number and we're good. Arrays also give us a great example, actually just like objects and their properties, how dynamic TypeScript's type inference is. If we add a for loop here at the bottom, and we want to go through all the hobbies of person, we can of course use a traditional for loop with for const hobby of person.hobbies, so accessing the hobbies property and going through all the hobbies there, storing each hobby for each iteration in this constant, and then we can console log hobby here. Now that's not too fancy, that's something we know from JavaScript, right? If I now compile this app.ts file down there, we get the name from this line and thereafter the two hobbies being printed. But what's actually interesting here is that on hobby, we can access anything we can access on any string. For example, to uppercase. I get this auto completion and TypeScript does not complain. Why does it not complain? Because it knows that hobbies is of type string array. So when I access person.hobbies, TypeScript's inference detects that hobbies will be an array of strings. So hobby, on the other hand, is correctly identified as being a string, because since we go through an array of strings, well, the individual values have to be just strings. And therefore TypeScript offers us great support down there and allows us to do anything with hobby that can be done with a string, because it knows with certainty that hobby will be a string because of the types we set up there. And that's really flexible and of course a great feature which makes writing code a lot easier and way more flexible and secure. For example, we would get an error here if I would try to access hobby.map if I thought this would be an array. The map method is available on arrays, but not on strings. And here correctly I get an error that map does not exist on type string because it doesn't. So here we get an error, and that's good that we get it, because this would be wrong. And here we see TypeScript's inference really shine.